Surely a duke deserves someone a little more charming, don't you think?
Charm is easy. Character is rare.
You don't have to answer that.
I already have, Clara.
Blood is thicker than water, but it stains much worse. Clara knew her sister's unannounced arrival wasn't a friendly visit. It was a calculated siege. Beatrice wanted the Duke, the title, and the satisfaction of leaving Clara empty-handed. She just didn't anticipate a man immune to rehearsed tears. The library of Oakhaven Manor smelled of dried lavender, floor wax, and the sharp tang of iron gall ink. It was an unpretentious room in an unpretentious house, built for reading and reckoning rather than entertaining. Clara sat at the heavy mahogany desk, her sleeves rolled up to the elbows, a smudge of ink on her left thumb. Across from her sat Henry Pendelton, the Duke of Westford. He was not a man who looked like he belonged in a London ballroom. Broad-shouldered and weather-beaten, Henry had the calloused hands of a man who personally inspected his tenant farms, and a quiet, steady gaze that made nervous people talk too much. Clara, however, was not nervous. She liked the quiet. She liked the way he sat in the worn leather armchair, thoroughly at ease, listening to her read off the crop yields for the western acreage. 60 bushels of winter wheat, assuming the frost holds off, Clara said, running her finger down the ledger. It is a slight decrease from last year, but the soil needs resting. I plan to rotate with clover in the spring. Henry nodded slowly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. A sensible precaution. Most men would push the soil until it turned to dust, just to keep the margins up for one more season. You have a long view, Clara. I appreciate that. Clara felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the late August heat pressing against the window panes. Their engagement was entirely practical, arranged between two people who had outgrown the foolishness of their 20s and wanted a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. Henry needed a duchess who could manage his vast estates while he attended to Parliament. Clara needed the security of a respectable marriage, after spending the last 5 years pulling her late father's ruined estate back from the brink of bankruptcy. It wasn't a romance out of a penny dreadful, but to Clara, it was something far better. It was safe. It was real. The heavy silence was shattered by the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel drive outside, followed immediately by the frantic barking of the estate hounds. Clara froze, her pen hovering over the ledger. Oakhaven received few visitors, and none without prior correspondence. Through the open window, Clara heard a voice that made the knot of warmth in her chest instantly turn to ice. It was a high, musical laugh, followed by a sharp command directed at a footman. "Beatrice," Clara murmured, setting her pen down. The ink blotted on the page, ruining the neat column of numbers. Henry looked up, noting the sudden tension in Clara's jaw. "Your sister? I was under the impression she was residing with your aunt in Bath for the season." "She was," Clara said, standing up and hastily pulling her sleeves down to cover her bare forearms. She smoothed the front of her plain gray wool dress, suddenly acutely aware of how drab she must look. "I cannot imagine what brings her back, unless she has exhausted Aunt Agatha's patience, which usually takes until October." Before Henry could reply, the heavy oak doors of the library were thrown open. Mrs. Higgins, Oakhaven's elderly housekeeper, looked harried and apologetic, but she was quickly pushed aside by a rustling wave of emerald green silk. Beatrice Ashdown stood in the doorway, chest heaving slightly, framed by the dark wood like a portrait designed to command attention. She was 4 years younger than Clara, and possessed the kind of striking, delicate beauty that made men walk into walls. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, save for one calculated curl that rested against her collarbone. She smelled of expensive French rose water, a heavy, cloying scent that immediately banished the smell of lavender and beeswax from the room. "Clara, darling," Beatrice cried, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She crossed the room in 3 long strides, her silk skirts swishing loudly, and threw her arms around Clara's stiff shoulders. Clara endured the embrace, keeping her hands rigidly at her sides. Beatrice, what are you doing here? We received no letter. Beatrice pulled back, her blue eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. Oh, the roads were absolutely dreadful, Clara. My carriage threw a wheel 2 miles past the toll gate, and the journey has been a nightmare. I felt so faint, I thought I might collapse right there in the dirt. She swayed slightly on her feet, a delicate flutter of movement, and turned her gaze toward the only man in the room. Beatrice's eyes landed on Henry, and she allowed a small, breathless gasp to escape her lips. She took a step toward him, her hand rising to her forehead. I am so sorry. The heat of the day, it is simply too much. She swayed again, this time far more dramatically, angling her body so that if she fell, she would land squarely against Henry's broad chest. Clara watched, a familiar exhaustion settling into her bones. This was Beatrice's favorite maneuver, the helpless maiden, the sudden swoon. It had worked on their father, it had worked on the vicar, it had worked on Clara's first suitor 3 years ago. Men were biologically programmed to catch falling women. Henry stood up. He did not rush forward. He did not extend his arms. Instead, he took one distinct, deliberate step backward and casually pulled a heavy wooden dining chair into the space he had just occupied. "Mind the chair, Miss Ashdown," Henry said, his voice flat and entirely devoid of panic. Beatrice, realizing there was no human cushion to break her fall, miraculously caught her balance just before her hip bruised against the wooden backrest. She gripped the chair, her knuckles turning white, a flash of genuine irritation breaking through her carefully constructed mask of frailty. Clara had to bite the inside of her cheek to stop a sudden, sharp smile. "Thank you," Beatrice managed to say, her voice slightly strained as she lowered herself into the chair. She looked up at Henry through her thick lashes, attempting a brave, fragile smile. "You must forgive me. I am Beatrice, Clara's younger sister, and you must be His Grace." "Westford," Henry replied softly, offering a shallow, polite bow. He did not kiss her hand. He did not offer his own. He simply stood there, a solid wall of tweed and wool, looking at her with the mild, detached interest of a man inspecting a peculiar piece of livestock. "Mrs. Higgins," he called out to the housekeeper, who was still hovering nervously in the hallway. Miss Ashdown requires a glass of water, and perhaps a cold compress for her vapors." Beatrice's jaw tightened at the word vapors, but she kept her smile fixed in place. "You are too kind, Your Grace. I am sure I will recover shortly. I only came because I heard the wonderful news of Clara's engagement. I simply could not let my only sister plan a wedding without me. I am here to help with everything." Clara looked at the ruined ledger on her desk. The siege had begun. Dinner at Oakhaven was usually a quiet affair. The dining room was long and cavernous, a relic of a time when the Ashdown family had possessed enough wealth to fill it. Tonight, the heavy mahogany table was set for 3 at the far end, huddled near the fireplace to ward off the slight chill that always crept into the stone walls after sunset. The meal was plain roast mutton, boiled potatoes, and wilted greens prepared by a cook whose skills prioritized nourishment over artistry. Clara sat at the head of the table, Henry to her right, and Beatrice directly across from him. Beatrice had spent 3 hours in the guest room recovering from her journey. She emerged wearing a gown of midnight blue velvet, cut notably low at the bodice, a strand of pearls resting against her collarbone. In the dim, flickering candlelight of the dining room, she looked radiant. Clara, still in her plain gray wool, felt like a sparrow sitting across from a peacock. But Clara did not let it show. She systematically cut her mutton, focusing on the mechanics of eating. "I must say, Clara," Beatrice began, pushing a single potato around her plate with the tip of her silver fork. "You are so terribly brave. Living out here in this drafty old house, managing the tenants, dealing with the mud and the livestock. Most women of our station would have simply perished from the boredom or the isolation. The estate requires managing, Beatrice, Clara said evenly. It is not a matter of bravery. It is a matter of necessity. Of course it is, darling, Beatrice sighed, taking a delicate sip of her wine. She turned her bright, focused gaze onto Henry. But it has made her so tough. Don't you agree, Henry? May I call you Henry? Your grace feels so terribly formal for family. You may call me Westford, Henry replied, his tone polite but unyielding. He sliced a piece of mutton and brought it to his mouth, chewing methodically. Beatrice blinked, a momentary falter in her rhythm, but quickly recovered. Westford, then. As I was saying, Clara has always been so self-reliant, fiercely independent. She never asked for help, even when we were girls. I was always the soft-hearted one, bringing home injured birds, weeping over stray dogs. Clara was the one who would tell me the bird was going to die anyway. Clara's grip on her knife tightened. The bird in question had been half-eaten by a fox. She had put it out of its misery quickly with a shovel, while Beatrice stood screaming on the lawn. But there was no use arguing with Beatrice's revisions of history. To defend oneself against a liar only made one look defensive. I just worry, Beatrice continued, her voice dropping an octave to convey deep, sisterly concern. She leaned forward slightly, allowing the candlelight to catch the swell of her chest. I worry that Clara is so used to taking care of herself that she has forgotten how to be taken care of. She views everything as a transaction, a ledger. I simply want you to know what you are taking on, Westford. Clara does not love easily. She is. Rihid. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Clara stared straight ahead, her throat tight. It was the same tactic Beatrice had used on Thomas 3 years ago. Clara is cold. Clara is difficult. Let me show you warmth. Let me show you softness. Henry finished his bite of food. He laid his knife and fork down across his plate, exactly parallel to one another. He picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth, and set it down. The deliberate slowness of his actions drew all the air out of the room. He looked directly at Beatrice. Miss Ashdown, Henry said, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried easily down the table. You seem to confuse competence with coldness, a common mistake among those who have never had to bear the weight of responsibility. Beatrice's smile froze. I only meant... I know exactly what you meant, Henry interrupted, entirely without heat, which somehow made the words cut deeper. You speak of your sister's independence as if it were a disease. I view it as her greatest asset. I am not looking for a fragile creature to faint in my hallways, nor do I require a wife who weeps over nature's cruelties while expecting someone else to hold the shovel. Clara snapped her gaze to Henry. He hadn't been there for the incident with the bird. He had simply deduced the reality of the situation from Beatrice's twisted narrative. Henry reached for his wine glass, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's pale face. You say she views life as a ledger. I say she understands the cost of things. When the roof of this manor collapsed in debt, Clara did not weep. She paid the creditors. She managed the soil. She preserved your family's name while you, I presume, were safely in Bath, being soft-hearted. Beatrice's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The flush that crept up her neck was not manufactured. It was the angry, mottled red of genuine humiliation. She looked toward Clara, expecting her older sister to intervene, to smooth the social waters, as she always did. Clara took a slow breath. She looked at her sister's trembling lip, and then she looked at the man sitting to her right. Henry took a sip of his wine, utterly unbothered by the tension he had just caused. The mutton is excellent tonight, Clara, Henry said casually, turning his attention back to her. Perhaps we might ask Mrs. Higgins for the recipe. The kitchens at Westford tend to over-roast the meat. I will ask her in the morning, Clara replied, her voice steady, though a rare, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. Beatrice pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping violently against the floorboards. I find I have lost my appetite, she announced, her voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. The journey has caught up with me. If you will excuse me. Rest well, Miss Ashdown, Henry said, not standing up to see her out. Beatrice turned on her heel and practically fled the room, her heavy velvet skirts dragging against the stone floor. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Clara and Henry alone in the vast dining room. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It felt clean, swept clear of the cloying scent of rosewater. Clara looked at her plate, a sudden, unexpected tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. You did not have to do that, she said softly. She will only try harder tomorrow. Henry picked up his fork and returned to his meal. Let her try. I have dealt with worse storms than a young woman in velvet, Clara. She will find no safe harbor here. He glanced sideways at her, his dark eyes softening just a fraction. Eat your dinner. We have the eastern leases to review after dessert. Morning frost clung to the tall grass of the paddocks, turning the sweeping lawns of Oakhaven into a landscape of brittle white glass. Inside the stables, the air was thick with the comforting, heavy heat of animal bodies, smelling sharply of oats, damp leather, and manure. Henry stood inside the stall of a massive gray gelding named Samson, running a bare hand down the animal's thick foreleg. He wore no coat, only a simple linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dusted with dark hair. He was checking a newly fitted shoe, his attention entirely absorbed by the angle of the iron and the hoof wall. Footsteps sounded on the cobblestone aisle. They were not the heavy, dragging boots of the stable master, but the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heeled boots. Henry did not look up from the horse's hoof. You are up early, Miss Ashdown, or perhaps you never went to sleep. Beatrice stopped at the edge of the stall. She was dressed in a tailored crimson riding habit that looked as though it had never seen the vicinity of an actual horse. The rich velvet swallowed the dim morning light, and her blonde hair was swept up into an intricate, flawless knot beneath a jaunty black riding hat. She looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of splintered wood and hay. I found it difficult to rest, Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a soft, intimate register. She stepped closer, resting her gloved hands on the wooden half-door of the stall. The silence of the country is so oppressive. I am accustomed to the life of the city, to conversation, to company. Then, Henry released Samson's leg and straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. He turned to face her, his expression utterly neutral. If you require noise, I can have the stable boys start banging the empty feed buckets together. Though I imagine Samson might object. Beatrice laughed, a light, trilling sound that bounced off the wooden rafters. You are teasing me, Westford. I like that. Clara never had much of a sense of humor. She takes everything so terribly seriously. It must be exhausting for you. I find competence invigorating, not exhausting, Henry replied. He tossed the rag onto a nearby barrel and walked toward the stall door. Beatrice did not step back to let him out. Instead, she leaned in slightly, forcing Henry to either stop or brush against her. Henry stopped. He crossed his arms over his chest, leaving 2 feet of empty space between them. Did you require a horse to be saddled, Miss Ashdown? The stable master does not arrive for another hour. I did not come for a horse, Beatrice said. She looked up at him through her eyelashes, her lips parted slightly. The scent of her heavy rosewater warred with the smell of the manure, creating a cloying, sickening sweetness in the air. I came to speak with you, alone, before Clara awakens and dictates the schedule for the day. Clara's schedules keep this estate from going under the auctioneer's hammer, Henry said mildly. Speak your piece. Beatrice sighed, a delicate exhalation meant to convey deep, reluctant sorrow. It pains me to do this. She is my sister, after all. But I cannot stand by and watch a man of your standing be used so callously. You must know why she agreed to marry you, Westford. It is not out of affection. Henry tilted his head slightly. Is it not? Of course not, Beatrice whispered, leaning closer, her eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. She is bankrupt. Our father left Oakhaven in ruins. Clara has spent the last 5 years desperately trying to hold it together, and she is failing. She does not look at you and see a husband, Henry. She looks at you and sees a bank, a title to shield her from the creditors. She is marrying you entirely for your fortune. She paused, waiting for the revelation to strike him, waiting for the anger and the wounded pride that always followed when a man realized his affection had been bought. Henry looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he let out a short, rough bark of laughter. It wasn't a chuckle. It was genuine, bewildered amusement. Beatrice flinched, stepping back from the stall door. I fail to see what is humorous about being deceived. Deceived? Henry asked, a broad smile still lingering on his face. Miss Ashdown, your sister and I spent 3 weeks negotiating our marriage settlement through our solicitors. We went over the Oakhaven debts, line by line. I know exactly how much she owes the bank in London, and I know exactly how much it will cost to repair the West Wing roof. It is itemized in the contract. Beatrice's jaw dropped slightly. The script she had rehearsed was crumbling in her hands. She told you? Good. She demanded I review the ledgers before she would even accept my proposal, Henry corrected, his tone shifting from amused to cold. She refused to enter a partnership under false pretenses. I am providing the capital to secure Oakhaven. In return, she brings her administrative brilliance to Westford, managing an estate 3 times this size so I can attend to my duties in the House of Lords. We have an alliance based on transparency and mutual benefit. He took a step forward, his towering frame forcing Beatrice to stumble backward into the aisle to give him room. He unlatched the stall door and stepped out, looking down at her panicked face. You came here hoping to expose a scandalous secret, Henry said, his voice dropping low, hard as iron. But the only thing you have exposed is your own fundamental misunderstanding of what a true partnership looks like. You operate in a world of whispers and traps, Miss Ashdown. Clara operates in the daylight. Now, if you will excuse me, I have actual work to do. Beatrice stared at him, her face flushed an ugly, dark red. The fragile, concerned sister act vanished instantly, replaced by a sneer that twisted her beautiful features into something sharp and bitter. You are a fool, she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. You think you have made a clever bargain? You are marrying a spinster who smells of ink and sheep dip. She will never love you. She doesn't know how. Henry did not blink. I would rather have Clara's cold ink than your false roses. I suggest you begin packing, Miss Ashdown. The carriage will be waiting for you after breakfast. He turned his back on her and walked down the aisle toward the tack room, the sound of his boots echoing loudly in the quiet stable. Clara sat in the library, staring blindly at a fresh page in the ledger. She had been awake since before dawn, her stomach tight with a restless anxiety she refused to name. She heard the heavy, urgent footsteps approaching down the hallway long before the door flew open. Beatrice stormed into the room, abandoning all pretense of elegance. Her velvet riding habit was streaked with dust, and her face was pale with fury. Behind her, Mrs. Higgins hovered in the doorway, wringing her apron in distress. You couldn't wait to poison him against me, could you? Beatrice shouted, slamming her gloved hands down on Clara's desk. The inkwell rattled ominously. Clara calmly moved the inkwell to a safer distance. "Mrs. Higgins, that will be all. Thank you." The housekeeper nodded quickly and pulled the heavy doors shut, leaving the sisters alone. Clara looked up at Beatrice, her expression carefully blank. "I have not spoken a word about you to Westford, Beatrice. I have not needed to. Do not play the innocent with me." Beatrice spat, her chest heaving. "I tried to warn him. I tried to tell him what you really are. A cold, calculating drudge who is bleeding him dry to save this rotting house. But you have him completely fooled. He actually thinks you are respectable." "I am respectable," Clara said softly. She stood up from the desk, smoothing her plain gray skirt. "Because I do the work, Beatrice. While you flitted from season to season, relying on your face to secure your future, I stayed here. I faced the men our father owed money to. I sold the silver. I learned the crop rotations. I survived. This, I survived. And now you think you deserve a duke?" Beatrice laughed bitterly. "Look at you, Clara. You are plain. You are stiff. You are a glorified housekeeper, wearing a ring." The words stung, hitting the exact, bruised center of Clara's deepest insecurities. But before she could formulate a response, the heavy oak doors swung open again. Henry stood in the doorway. He had put on his tweed jacket, though he still smelled faintly of the stables. His eyes swept over the room, taking in Beatrice's aggressive posture and Clara's stiff shoulders. He walked into the room, bypassing Beatrice entirely, and came to stand directly beside Clara. He didn't say a word to the younger sister. Instead, he reached out and took Clara's ink-stained hand in his calloused fingers wrapping warmly around hers. "The carriage is brought round to the front drive, Miss Ashdown," Henry said, his voice mild, though his grip on Clara's hand was firm and grounding. "Your trunks have been loaded." Beatrice looked at their joined hands, her lip curling in disgust. She realized, finally and entirely, that there was no crack in the stone wall to exploit. There was no vanity for her to flatter, no masculine pride for her to manipulate. "You deserve each other," Beatrice sneered, gathering her velvet skirts. Two dreary, practical people, rotting away in the mud. She spun around and marched out of the library, her heels clicking furiously against the floorboards. A few moments later, the heavy front door slammed shut, echoing through the quiet house, followed by the crunch of carriage wheels, tearing away down the gravel drive. Silence descended on the library. It was the deep, settling quiet of a house that had just expelled a sickness. Clara let out a long, shaky breath, suddenly feeling very tired. She looked down at her hand, still securely held in Henry's. Gently, she tried to pull away, not wanting to presume upon the physical contact, now that the performance was over. But Henry did not let go. His fingers tightened slightly, keeping her tethered to him. "I am sorry for what she said to you," Henry murmured, turning to look down at her. "She is a remarkably venomous creature." "She is not entirely wrong," Clara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She looked at the ruined ledger on her desk, avoiding his gaze. "I am practical. I am not. I do not know how to be what a man expects a wife to be. I only know how to manage things." Henry reached his free hand up and gently hooked a knuckle under her chin, tilting her face up until she was forced to look at him. His dark eyes were remarkably gentle, devoid of the harshness he had shown Beatrice. "Clara," he said softly, "I do not want a woman who swoons in my arms. I want a woman who can stand at my back. I want a partner who knows the price of the world and isn't afraid to pay it. You are exactly what I bargained for." He paused, his thumb brushing lightly against her jawline, and perhaps slightly more than I dared hope for. The warmth in his gaze was entirely genuine, stripped of all polite artifice. Clara felt the tight, heavy knot of defensive armor in her chest finally, irrevocably loosen. She did not need to perform. She did not need to hide the ink on her fingers. She just needed to be exactly who she was. She smiled, a true, bright expression that changed her entire face, making her look undeniably beautiful. Shall we review the Eastern leases then, Westford? Henry smiled back, his thumb lingering on her cheek for a second longer before he dropped his hand. Lead the way, Clara. Lead the way. Did you love seeing the Duke shut down Beatrice's toxic manipulation and choose a woman of true substance? If you enjoyed this deeply grounded historical romance, hit that like button and share it with fellow drama lovers. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on more stories where intellect and loyalty triumph over deceit. Drop a comment below what would you have said to Beatrice. See you in the next video.